Yeah. Okay. Erev Tov, everybody. Every time we've met up, the news cycle is just so difficult to keep up with. I mean, now we're getting to a crescendo, and let's hope, without getting into the current day, but it's always in our, certainly in my mind when I learn Tanakh, because learning Tanakh, as I said on Shabbat, Back to the Future, is learning the past in order to be able to handle what's coming up in the future. And we are certainly going to be learning in Sefer Shmuel about leadership. That's one of the big challenges of Sefer Shoftim, and Sefer Shmuel, I think, is one of the antidotes, one of the refuot l'makah. But I just want to dedicate the learning that Mitzvah Hashem Shabbat will all, switch on at, 6 o'clock approximately in the evening, and we'll read about all the Hachtufim have come home, and it should all happen b'zchut and the limud and Bezrat Hashem, because it's long overdue. And those images of what we saw last Shabbat, I mean, it's haunting. It's beyond haunting. It's really, really shocking. Okay, we got going on Sefer Shmuel. I'm very excited about that. Firstly, again, thank you to everybody who made the Kiddush happen on Shabbat, and those who attended. And it was fun talking in English in a shul, which I don't think has ever had an English year before, certainly not in that public forum. So when I asked one of the young Israeli boys, I said, how much did you say? How much did you understand? He said, 50%, he said to me, but I didn't say it in Hebrew. It was just funny. But there you go. So Baruch Hashem, it was really special, and I look forward to the next year. Let's get there. In terms of where we're going with Sefer Shmuel, Perek Aleph is really, it's expression in the Talmud, Malay v'Gadush. It's like overflowing. Everything you look at is incredible. So this evening we're going to try and deal with two issues. The issue of Penina, trying to understand what was going on, and particularly one of the very difficult, not even midrash, is an explanation of the psukim, because later on Penina is referred to in Chana's very famous tefillah, what happened to Penina, and the question then is why it happened. We saw last time that she was taunting. She was holding up the onesie, right? She was saying, here, I've got a onesie and you haven't got anything, trying to get Chana to daven, and clearly that was part of the pressure that she was trying to apply. Chana was barren. She didn't have a child. The rabbis say it was nearly 20 years that she was davening, coming to the Mishkan every year. We learned last time about how Elkanah got everybody, galvanized the whole country to come to the Mishkan, which was pretty amazing. And all of that stuff that we've learned before. So I want to deal a little bit with Penina, and also maybe a little bit with the story of the vow, because everybody knows the vow of Chana. Chana vowed to bring Shmuel to the temple, right? It's one of those things that I even remember learning it in school, where I had a non-Jewish Bible teacher many, many years ago. And this is one of the stories we learned. It was a vow to bring Samuel to the temple. Wonderful. The only problem is when you actually look at the psukim, it's not quite as clear as it sounds. I love to take the canards of learning and slightly not to undermine them, but to challenge them. So we're going to see. The question is going to be, what exactly did Chana say? Was it really a vow? Was it more of a statement? Well, we'll come to it, Mitzvah Hashem, in due course. Just a little bit of what I sent out, the handout that I sent out. If you have it on your phones, you'll see it there. This, again, I'm taking this, I'm printing this stuff from the final copy of Please God the book, which I'm waiting to hear about the final editing being completed. So Mitzvah Hashem should be happening sooner than later, I hope. The story at the top here is really very distressing. After Penina decided to, good evening, come in, hi, Erev Tov. After Penina decided to do what she did, we're told that Chana was blessed eventually with children, and there is this very, very distressing statement of the rabbis. And in fact, Chana is attributed with having 7 children, although we're only told that she actually gave birth to 5 children. It mentions the whole thing in chapter 2. What we are told, however, is that Penina had 10 children, And there is a kind of reverse relationship between the children of Hannah and the children of Penina. And this is very distressing. This is the piece on the page, and I just want to go through this before we go back to the text, and you'll see what's going on here. I'm sorry the print is so small, but I wanted to get it all on one page. And again, you've got it here in the English translation as well, but I'm going to read it in the Hebrew. It says like this, Seveim Belechem Niskaru, a verse from chapter 2 of the book of Shmuel, translated, those who are satiated with bread become intoxicated. Sounds like the Kiddush on Shabbat. Zu Penina shaita sveya bebanim benishtakra. So Penina had many children. We're told she had 10 sons. That, by the way, is why when Elkanah says, am I not, like the equivalent of 10 sons, he actually mentions 10 sons, if I'm not mistaken, what we saw last week. Am I not better for you than 10 sons? He's referring to the 10 sons of Penina, which again is very, very interesting that, she was having children the whole time, whereas Hannah was not blessed. However, the Gemara says here, this Midrash Shmuel, the Buba edition, I don't know which Buba, Solomon Buba, I think it was. And he says the following, second line, Rabbi Huda Omer, B'nai Bonim Kabonim, so it's either referring to grandchildren, I'll leave that to one side, but Rabbi Nechemia Omer, now here comes a very shocking statement. Haya L'Penina Asara Banim. We know, in fact, Penina had 10 sons, 10 children. Haita Chana Yoledet. Chana was eventually blessed with children, and she had echad, she had one child. Penina koveret shnaim. At the same time, Penina lost 2 children. Unbelievable. And he went on. Chana Yoledet shnaim. She had the second child, Chana. Penina koveret arba. Now Penina lost another 2. She now buried 4 children. Shlosha Penina koveret shisha. When again another child, and Penina had lost another 2 children. She didn't get, she must have got the message by now. Arba'ah, Penina Kaveret Shmoni, went to 4 children of Hannah, and Penina had lost 8 children. It's shocking. And one has to ask the question, I know Penina was vexing Hannah and causing her all the grief, but how do we understand this punishment? And the comment is made, Kivan she'avra chamishi, when she became pregnant for the 5th time, Hannah, but Bata Penina Vinshtaka Raglea, Penina came and good evening. And she literally got down on her knees. Amra la mevakasha mimech. She said, I beg of you, Chana, I beg of you. Hit palali al shnaim v'yichyu. Pray for my last 2 children, they'll live. Because I know that till now, every time you've had a child, I've lost 2 children. This is an unbelievable story. And it says, it palala aleihem, Chana daven, as one would expect, v'hayu nikra'im al-shema, and they were counted not as Penina's children, but actually as Chana's children, because it was the children that Chana had saved. So this whole scenario of Penina losing her children as seemingly a punishment for what she did to Chana needs a bit of explanation. In the end of the day, Penina was definitely had the intention, as we would say, l'shem shamayim. She wasn't doing something negatively. She was doing something which we have to understand was to try and encourage Chana to go to the depths. Mima amakim karaticha Hashem, I call you from the depths, and get Chana to daven even harder. And of course, eventually Chana was answered. She was blessed with children. So the question is, how did Penina deserve in any way, if we can understand it, this terrible punishment? Right? Penina was trying to do good things, and lo aleinu, God, sort of, we say chas v'shalom, God forbid this should ever happen. She was in a position of losing children. So this is a question which is raised by a number of very interesting people, including Rav Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the famous Netziv. Right? He wrote on Tanakh, I'm glad to say, one of the great Roshei Yeshiva of the 19th century. And he says the following, and he makes a statement which, in fact, Rabbi Shmulevitz, Chaim Shmulevitz of the Meir Yeshiva also writes about this in his Shiurim. These were 2 great men from the Yeshiva world who actually wrote on the Bible, I'm very glad to say, because a lot of people didn't study Tanakh for a whole bunch of strange reasons in those days. And he says that this is an example of something that we spoke about before. If you remember the story of Yael, we read it on Shabbat. The story of Yael, she seduces, for want of a better word, Sisera. She seduced him. She actually took him into the tent, and according to the rabbi, she wore him out by having relations with him over and over again till he was exhausted, And then she took the hammer, boom, and knocked the peg in his head. That's the rabbinic explanation of what happened to Sisera. And the rabbis asked, but wait a minute, Yael, how could she do this? This is clearly Aveira. This is clearly a sin. She's doing an act of immorality. And the answer the rabbis give, and this is the quote on the page from the Gemara in Nazir, but it's quoted in other places, that is called Aveira Lishma. It's a sin for the sake of God. And there are many examples of it. I brought on the page, there's the famous example of Shaul. He went to the witch of Endor. How could he go to this woman? She's practicing something which the Torah forbids. It's like absolutely forbidden. But Machshefa lo techaya says that the Torah, you're not allowed to allow to live. She's deserving of death. And Shaul goes to her to find out what's going to be. And the answer then is again that it's called Aveira Lishma, for the sake of God. But we'll explain what that means in a minute. The interesting one, which I always like to refer to, is coming up now, is Purim. That after the whole story, you get 10 chapters on the Megillah, and it leaves everything in situ. What do I mean? That Esther stays with Achashverosh, and Mordechai Rov Echav is not accepted only by everybody, only by the majority of the brethren, as we say, which is also very interesting. You can never win as the rabbi. And the reality is that what happens with Esther is that she stays with Achashverosh and they have a child. And the child is called Darius. And according, again, some rabbis have different versions of this, but there is a definite a school of thought that this is the Darius who's mentioned later on in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. He's mentioned there that he was responsible for allowing the second temple to be built. So again, what is Esther doing? She's living with a non-Jew. I mean, you can't get more blatant than what Esther was doing. And everybody knew about it. It wasn't if it was in secret. This was done in public. And nevertheless, what happened was that in the sin, there was what was called Lishma, for the sake of God. So one of the commentaries says, what it always means, same we said with Shimshon, the same thing. The whole idea is that when you're doing the sin for the sake of the Jewish people, you're doing it for the sake of, saving Am Yisrael. Saving Am Yisrael means you're doing something which hopefully will lead to a salvation, like Shimshon marrying the Philistine women in order to be able to be accepted in Philistine society, so that he can then drive them nuts and take all the pressure away from the Jewish people. He's saving Am Yisrael. He's saving Jewish people from a tremendous war. Otherwise, they'd have another war with the Philistines, which would have been disastrous. They lost we're going to read about it, they lost the ark because with the war with the Philistines. So reality is that when we're talking about a sin for the sake of God, there are examples, not many, but there are some examples in the Bible of this. And Rabbi Berlin, the Tziv, the rabbi of the Volozhin Yeshiva, said that this is what happened with Penina. Penina decided that she knew Chana was going to have a very special child. She saw the way that Elkanah and Chana, they related to each other, and she knew that God would bless Chana with a child. So what did she do? She decided that she was going to put all her effort into making Chana as, not, I suppose we're going to use the word, as miserable, as depressed, as sad as possible, to be able to encourage her in that way to daven as hard and as specifically in a righteous way as she could. And the problem is like this, and this is what Rabbi Shmuel said. He said that the problem was that Penina, and I'm throwing it out here, I'm not saying this is absolutely the way to go, and I'm interested to hear your reaction. I'm sure Ron will have something to say about this. But the reality is that Penina, in her calculation, Reb Shmulevitz and Rabbi Berlin both say she made a mistake. That she decided that she was going to do this sin for the sake of God, to get Chana to pray in a way which was so, it was soul destroying what was happening to Chana. But at the same time, Chana was davening from the depths of her soul, and eventually she was blessed by God. Penina made a calculation which in the end, although the consequence was okay, the way she went about it was a calculation which she was not entitled to make. And as a consequence of that, says Rabbi Berlin, and it's a strong suggestion, but it's a very difficult suggestion, and I used to get pushback when I taught this in New York, so I'm not worried if you all push back on me, but I'm just throwing it out there because it demands an explanation. Penina overstepped the mark. And if she overstepped the mark, look what happened to her. The reality was that because she pushed Hannah in a way which maybe she wasn't entitled to do, eventually when Hannah has a child, Penina loses 2 of her children. It's terrible. And it just shows that, again, in the world of tzaddikim, in the world of these righteous people, their relationship to God is something which is, it's something which is challenging. And more than challenging, something which demands our attention. And when we see something like this, we're allowed to ask the question. I'm not sure if the answer is a great answer, but at least we're allowed to ask the question. If Penina was meaning so in such a positive way to get Hannah to daven, why was she punished in such a terrible way? And Rabbi Berlin wants to suggest because it was an Aveira Lishma which she was not allowed to perform, meaning she wasn't allowed to do to Hannah what she actually did. I'm throwing it out there as a suggestion. I hope people maybe have a different suggestion to explain Penina's predicament. The Psukim clearly established that Penina did have this terrible punishment as a consequence, and it also tells us about Hannah's children. As I said, Hannah had 5, which became 7, because the 2 children that didn't die in the end, when Hannah had her 5th child, are attributed not anymore to Penina, the 2 children of Penina, they're attributed to Hannah. So in the end, you'll see in chapter 2, Hannah is described as having 7 children, not 5 children. So I've put it out there because, again, I struggle with this because, you say in Ivrit, c'est not fair, right? It really is not fair what's happened to Penina. Penina had all the good intention. And she was called a tzaddikus in rabbinic literature. She's known as a righteous woman. And maybe that's the reason, God judges the righteous at a very high level of a very high standard of spirituality. I don't know what to say, right? I'm struggling to get this message across, but at the same time, I've got to do something. I've got to put it out there because otherwise we're left with this terrible dilemma. How do I understand Penina, who was meaning so positively towards Hannah, and ends up with such a terrible punishment?
That was the question.
Yeah, please.
Last week I mentioned you after the show about the medrash that says that it was it wasn't because of what Penina had done, but it was because of the fact that Elkanah had promised Hannah that he was going to be the best husband and the best person, and that she came to the realization.
Yeah.
That she needed that she was the only one who could turn the situation around because he had given up on them having having children.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why Penina was judged so harshly, because it wasn't what Penina did that made Hannah change the direction of work, because she was relying on everybody else to daven.
Yeah. And therefore that's that's an interesting suggestion. Yeah, Yecholiyot. I as I said, I'm not casting in stone this my interpretation. I'm relaying it because it's something that I found. It sort of made me sleep a bit better at night because otherwise I was really bothered by this. There's a wonderful story. Nechama Leibowitz told the story, the famous Bible teacher. Motzi Yom Kippur, she was in a cab. She always told about stories about being in taxis. I studied with her for 6 months. She didn't drive. She's always driven places. And she saw the cab driver and she looked at him. She said, I don't know who she knew who he was. I think Yossi his name was. He said, Yossi, you look tired after Yom Kippur. So he said, well, why? You look as if you haven't slept all night. So he said, Ken, lo yashanti kol halayla. I haven't slept all night. So she said to him, well, you okay? Did you eat wrong thing after the fast? She said, no. She said, he said to her, I was bothered by Mufti Yonah. He was bothered about the story of Yonah. And he kept him awake the whole night. And the Hamas said, Mika Amcha Yisra, after Yom Kippur, that you have a cab driver who was bothered by the story of Yonah, that he couldn't sleep the whole night. She was just overwhelmed by this. And of course, she then spent the rest of the journey and probably another hour sitting in the cab trying to explain to him what exactly was going on with the story of Yonah. Amazing teacher. She really was an amazing teacher. I hope some of you knew her or at least know of her. I mentioned her name in a shir in Cherry Hill when I was there last year in New Jersey, and one of the more right-wing gentlemen came over to me and said, a wonderful shir, but who's Nechama Leibowitz? And I thought, okay, we need to have words. And I explained to him in words of one syllable who this incredible woman really was. Anyway,
may I ask a question?
Please.
The paragraph you just read,
about
the sons dying and everything.
Yeah.
Is that midrash?
It is, and
So it's not text.
It's not text, except that the text begs the question of what happened, why Penina is attributed in a way, or rather why Hannah is attributed, number one, with 7 children, when the reality was we know she only had 5. And the Midrash sort of weaves the connection between the births that Hannah experienced and the deaths that unfortunately Penina went through.
Okay.
So there's information that it's weaving together.
So it's somebody took a bit of information, took a button, and sewed a vest around it.
Yeah.
And so they're making a story that we can't confirm or
right, and it's like everything, sir.
That the path to hell is filled with
good intentions. Yeah,
so,
I get that. Yeah,
but people need to understand that there's a difference between text and what it says.
Yeah.
And
well, I like. I'll just push back a little bit on what you said, because I just like the fact that Midrash becomes sensitive. The rabbis became very sensitive to what was going on between the interaction between Hannah and Penina, and that we know there was an interaction because they were co-wives.
Don't you feel in many instances, and in fact you've mentioned it several times during class, that sometimes the rabbis err on the side of the not right thing to justify a story or a character's behavior.
Yeah.
And maybe this is the same thing. Penina, who died and made her queen, that she should start saying what Hannah should do. Hannah knew what to do. We see that she knew what to do when she went to the Beit Hamikdash.
Correct.
I mean the Beit
with the Mishkan. Correct.
And so who was she to say you should daven harder?
Right. And that, I would say, is the bottom line explanation. And I'm not unhappy going with that. I'll be honest with you.
Okay.
I like the fact that the rabbis showed the interaction in a bigger way, but obviously their interpretation opens up a Pandora's box of trying to understand that if that's the case, why did Penina get so badly punished? It was a terrible punishment to lose all her children. No, terrible.
One of the lessons I wants to understand is when you think you're doing an Aveira Lishma, be very sure before you do anything. So
correct.
Midrash really wants us to say there are other ways Penina could have, at least in the Midrash's perspective, there are other ways Penina could have gotten Hannah to daven, and the way she chose was
extreme,
not necessarily appropriate, and that's why she ends up paying. That's
correct.
Whether it's a true story or not is irrelevant. That's the lesson the Midrash.
There is maybe a lesson that's coming out of it. Yeah. I don't want to get hung up on this, but I threw it out there because I thought it was worthy of attention. And as I said, if you in New York, there was a lot of students who pushed back on this and were not very happy with it, and rightly so. It's not cast in stone, but I'm sharing it with you because I think it's worthy at least of consideration. I'm going to put it like that. Very British, right? I got away with that.
Maybe they really didn't die physically. I mean, where does it say that they were buried? Maybe they were, when Penina dies, they become the children of Hannah.
Yeah.
And so that is how she acquires the children, not that they really died.
Yeah. It's a whole explanation. We'll come to in chapter 2. Right. Chapter 2, verse 5,
right,
where there is a reference. The barren woman was born 7. She that had many children had been bereaved. So the rabbis say that's Hannah and Penina.
Right.
So it's talking about the verse, which clearly says one had and one lost.
I understand that.
So that's how the whole connection is made. So I'm on safe ground, at least in terms of the verse, but in terms of the pyramid that is built by the Midrash. Yesh Amar Ladaber. One can certainly, I wouldn't say challenge it, but certainly discuss it. And
so when maybe Penina dies, they become a more cohesive family.
There's a lot of ifs and buts, and it does beg the question what the family dynamic was about.
Right.
What I like so much is the fact that we have to come to terms with the fact that Shmuel comes out of all of this.
Right.
So this is not a dysfunctional family, or at least it does on the surface, although there are issues that are clearly difficult there, but it produces a Shmuel and Avi. And Shmuel HaNavi is an inspiration, not just for the family, for the whole of the Jewish people.
Right.
And not just the whole Jewish people, everyone sitting in this room. Because without Shmuel HaNavi, we wouldn't have David HaMelech. And without David HaMelech, we wouldn't have Mashiach. I mean, he's affected every one of our lives, even though he lived 2,500 years ago.
Right.
Amazing.
Right.
So you see what I'm saying? That's where I'm going with this.
Right.
But I'm being a little bit brave, but I'm.
Don't you think that out of every dysfunctional family that comes someone very positive?
I hope so. I hope so. I don't want to generalize.
Family that comes dysfunction.
Correct.
It doesn't
Correct.
skip
Correct.
a generation.
Yeah,
you know,
it.
how common was it to have two wives?
It was pretty common. He says here polygamy was common till the 1,000 years ago.
It wasn't a question of how it was the norm.
It was the norm. Yeah.
I mean, out of Moshe Rabbeinu's family comes the Kohen who was in the house of
right, Pesel Micha.
You know,
Yeah.
So
I was learning today, Rav Shaker, right? Nobody's heard of Rav Shaker. It turns out he was the second child of Chizkiyahu Melech, one of the greatest kings who ever lived in the Jewish world. And he had a son who not only went off the rails, he went to Assyria and became a general in the army, fighting the Jews and announcing to the Jewish people that you've got to abandon God. He blasphemed against God. So it happens. It happens. That's a subject which, again, we will revisit, particularly David HaMelech. His whole family wants to kill him. His whole family wants to kill him. I'm going to go back to the text because I want to get back on track. So listen to this. We're in chapter 1, and I think we got up to this wonderful statement, am I not better for you than 10 sons? Which, again, is very upsetting. Obviously, he doesn't get it, Elkanah. And again, there's a human side to all of this. As holy and incredible as he was, he made a statement here which just made Hannah more and more upset. We'll look at verse 9. So Hannah now sort of gets up after the meal. Eli Kohen Yoshev al Kisei Mezuzat Heichal Hashem. Eli is sitting there by the door or whatever he's doing there. He's an old man. Eli Kohen, who was the judge at this time, was clearly very old, as you'll see as the story develops. And Yud Vehi Morat Nafesh, Hannah was very bitter of soul. But Titpalel al Hashem Bachot Tivkeh. She davened to God, and Bachot Tivkeh, she was crying her eyes out. And it's, sometimes you see this. I've seen this in shuls on the men's side as well as on the women's side, especially when you get to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, people weeping. And there was a guy, I think 2 years ago in Yom Kippur, when we were at a program, and every Amida, he was weeping. I mean, it was really, again, you just don't know people's situation, but it was really something. Listen to this. This verse is a kicker. I'm not going to go into in great detail, but I'm going to share this with you briefly. Pasuk Yudala, the famous verse. Batidon neder v'tomah. So she made a vow, and she said, Hashem Tzavaot, the Lord of hosts, Imra'ot Tireh Ba'ani Amatecha. If you look upon the affliction of your mates of me, in other words, Uzachartani v'lo tishkach et Amatecha, you will remember me, do not forget your servant. V'notata la'amat chazer Hashem, you'll grant me a child. Unatativ l'Hashem kol yimei chaya. I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. Umora lo yaleh arosho, which is normally translated that he'll never have a razor upon his head. In other words, he's never going to go to the barber. I guess that's good news. He'll save on the fee, the barber's fee. However, there's a problem here. And the problem is that although that is the normal translation, the Targum, right, the Aramaic translation, says, Umarvat enash lo tehei aloi. Moran means also fear. And it says that he will never be afraid. So make up your mind. Does it mean he'll never have a shave, he'll always have long hair, which implies that he's going to become what is called in the Torah Nazir, a Nazarite? Or does it mean he's never going to be afraid because he's going to be such an impressive leader, he's going to be so strong, he's never going to have fear of anybody? And it turns out that is a machloket right back in the early days of the discussion. Again, the rabbis were discussing this pasuk, trying to understand what does it mean, right? And therefore, here I'm allowing myself to go into this again, thinking about midrash. This is not midrash. This is really pshat. And the rabbis there's two rabbis. There's Rabbi Nehorai, which I believe is actually Rabbi Meir, if I'm not mistaken, but he was called Nehorai because Nehorah means a light. He was a light to the world, as the word Meir. So he was he sort of had this double title. I think I'm right on that. And he says that Morah lo yaleh rosho means a razor, because he says we find the same expression with Samson. And we know Shimshon was a Nazarite, so it turns out that Shmuel was also a Nazarite. Fine. So, he compares the two expressions. Said Rabbi Yossi, he said no. He said Morah here means fear of man. Doesn't mean a Nazarite. In other words, he disagrees. He says that it's possible that Shmuel was not a Nazarite, which is a very big chiddush, because it's really a major statement, because our image of Shmuel is, if you ever seen the pictures of the Nazir, there was until 1970 in Jerusalem, there was a Nazir. He was a Ram. He was one of the Rosh Yeshiva in Merkaz Arav Yeshiva. And he was the father-in-law of Rabbi Goren. His son, Reb Shah Yeshuv Cohen, was the chief rabbi in Haifa, a man called Reb David Hakai, very amazing individual. And he never cut his hair. When you see pictures of him with the round glasses, he looks like John Lennon. It's really weird. There's a real comparison there. Not in lifestyle, I assure you, but certainly in the way he looked. Really, really interesting. So what is going on here? Is he a Nazir or is he not a Nazir? And so interesting, and I'm not going to go into the depths of this, because the question really begs to be asked, if you're saying that he was a Nazarite, meaning that Hannah promised to bring him to the temple and that he will become a Nazarite, there is a very major problem. He's not yet born. How can Hannah commit him to do something which he's not in the world? I can commit myself to become a Nazarite if I'm alive. I can maybe make a suggestion to someone else to adopt such a lifestyle, because it means there's no wine, there's no, you've got to be careful about laws of purity. There's a whole bunch of things. But Shmuel's not born. He's not even in the world yet. So how could Hannah come along and say that he's going to become a Nazarite? And therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, because of that, maybe he wasn't a Nazarite. It could very well be that, in fact, what it means is that he's never going to be afraid. He's going to be such an amazing leader that he's going to be so outstanding that he will never have the fear of man upon him. Amazing. Amazing thing to be able to promise. Rashi points out, and he also says, when the Tativ Lashem, which we always thought was Hannah's promise to give Shmuel to the temple, Rashi says, Shehei Ra'oi Letito Lashem, that he should be fitting, he should be of a caliber to be given to the temple. So again, Rashi is basically saying not that she committed to give him to the temple, because he's not yet born. How could she make a commitment for him? Rashi is actually saying, and this is the point which I don't want to go off track, because it's a halachic issue, but the reality is that there's a whole train of thought here which is suggesting that Hannah did not actually make the vow that we thought she made. We thought the vow was, I'm going to make a vow to bring him to the temple. And by bringing him to the temple, he'll be a Nazarite, he'll be holy, the whole 9 yards, everything that's going to happen to him. It could very well be, and this is the suggestion that Rashi is following the other track, which suggests that maybe Hannah's vow was not about the son at all. She just vowed to bring a donation. She wanted to bring, and it says later on, she brought cheese and she brought bread and the whole donation. What she was saying was that I'm making a vow, says Hannah, and in the vow that I am making, I am hoping that by making this donation, I will merit a child who will, in the course of his life, be worthy of being brought to the temple. Right? And that is, again, and Rashi suggests this, and I saw the explanation, because the verse says, Vatidor neder, she makes a vow, Vatomar, and then she speaks, as if there are two stages here. Number one is the vow. Number two is what she actually says. And it could very well be, and this is a suggestion according to Rashi's interpretation, that her vow was not what we thought it was. It wasn't that she's bringing Shmuel to the temple to be a Nazir, to be the Nazarite in the temple. No, she is making a vow to make a donation, and in the course of that, she's saying, and I hope that as a consequence of my donation, God will bless me with a child who will be fitting, right, as a condition, hopefully, will be fitting enough to live up to my expectation of him working in the temple. But it could be that she didn't actually vow to bring him to the temple at all.
Really?
And that's interesting for another reason, because the reality is he was going to go and work in the temple anyway, right? Because he's a Levi, and Levium would work in the temple. So what is she vowing to do, which he's not going to do anyway, right? And the Radak says the vow was that she's going to bring him, instead of the age of 20, she would bring him at the age of 5, bring him early. But the Radak says dachuk, it's a little bit, he hasn't got a good answer for the question. But according to Rashi, it turns out that the vow may have been a different vow. Rambam, who has also a line on all of this, and I'm just throwing it out there because I want you to know this. Rambam says no. He says that the woman can make a vow even though Shmuel is not born, because she's not making a vow on him, she's making a vow on herself. She's saying, I'm committing myself to give this young man, when he's born, and I know I'm going to have a child, I'm going to give him an education which will encourage him to go and work in the temple and become one of the greatest Jews who ever lived. The mother made the ultimate commitment to educate her child, not in a dogmatic way, but in an encouragement way. She was going to encourage him to go to the temple. And of course, if that's the case, then when she says that he'll never have a morah, it means literally a razor, because she is committing him to become a Nazarite when he's born, not committing the child, but committing herself to follow through on her promise. So what I'm suggesting is, without going into this, I don't want to get more complicated than that there are in fact two ways of understanding her vow. We always thought she made a vow to take Shmuel to the temple. Turns out that works out maybe according to Rambam, who she can, not that she made a vow on the baby, she made a vow on herself, that she would eventually bring Shmuel to the temple. But according to Rashi, it turns out maybe that's not the vow at all. The vow was just that she's making a donation. In the merit of the donation, she's praying that her son will become the Tativ, be of the caliber that I will be able to bring him and deposit him, as it were, in the Mishkan. Now, I don't know if that's registered, and if it hasn't registered, please, don't, as I said before, don't lose sleep over it. But I just wanted to throw it out there because it does change an interpretation of this story, which I think we all grew up with. We all grew up with the statement that Hannah made a promise to bring Shmuel to the temple. Not so straightforward. If you actually carefully read the commentary on the verse itself, it turns out that maybe her vow was not exactly the way it seems. And I do this very often because I like to show you the not just the depth of what we're learning, but also the variety of what we're learning. Right? The reality is that there's so many accepted interpretations, and very often you can challenge it and you come out with a whole different way of looking at things. And not a bad exercise. On the contrary, it makes you more aware of the nuances of the Hebrew, makes you more aware of the story. It just throws a whole different light on everything. Because by giving the interpretation, for instance, like the Rambam, who says that she committed herself towards Shmuel, it's a whole lesson in education. For an educator, it's a really important thing to understand that the education of the child, as much as we rely on our teachers and we rely on the school, it does come from a very strong home environment, which hopefully is focused on that. I was speaking about it this morning, and I'll just share this story with you. The Lord Jacobitz, I've just got his book over here, an interesting book about him. He was an old family friend of my wife's, and very chief rabbi of England for about 30 years, till from 67 till I think he retired in 1990. And he told the story very often that all of his kids remained very staunchly Orthodox, but again, there's a famous doctor in Baltimore, Joel Jacobitz, one of the sons. In London, there's a whole, now one of the daughters is, a number of the daughters are living in Israel. And we asked him, what was your secret? How did you keep them all on the straight and narrow? How did you do it? And his answer was very interesting. He said every year for a month to 6 weeks, he would take the family, go in in England it's called a caravan, in America RV. He would rent this vehicle, which was like a mobile home, and he would travel all over England with the family. And there was absolutely no way that he could be contacted unless it was an emergency of proportions, God is calling. That would be the only answer he would answer. And he left, instructions. If you need to get hold of me, I'm going to be in this place on July 30th and this place on August 15th. And he did this every summer. Now, not only was he so focused on the family like that, but of course his wife Amelie was as well. Amazing woman who needs a whole shiur about her in their own right. But the reality was that's what he did. He focused every year, and it had an effect. It really, really had an effect. And this is, again, what I think we're learning here. Hannah makes that dedication, that focus, that commitment to Shmuel, and it's beautiful. And I'll just read here the famous thing, because I'm always getting to the end of my time in terms of the story. Pasuk Yudbet, Va'ayaki here batalit palel devei Hashem. She davened and davened and davened. The Eli shomel at Pia. Eli was just watching her davening. And he's thinking to himself, what is this woman? She comes back every year and she's shuckling and she's shaking and, doing the whole thing. And it says, she was literally speaking her heart. She was praying with all her heart. Her lips were moving. This is how we learn how to daven to this very day. Your lips should move, but you shouldn't make a big noise that you're disturbing the person next to you. But her voice was not heard. So it was enunciating, but to herself. And this is my favorite comment of the Vilna Gaon. Eli thought she was a drunk because she's standing there and she's swaying and she's mumbling and this verschnicked woman keeps coming back every year. And the Vilna Gaon says, how did Eli come to that conclusion? A wild interpretation, because Eli used to wear this breastplate. Right? And the breastplate used to light up. When he prayed to God, he would have Hebrew letters, and the letters would be an answer. It was like a direct line to God. So he got the answer because he asked Hashem, he said, who is this woman? And he got the letters Shin, Chaf, Resh, Hey, which he read Shikara. Of course, if you juggle it around, you get the word Chaf, Shin, Resh, Hey, Kashera, that she was very kosher. Or even more, Kasara, she was like Sarah. She was as holy as Sarah. And he just blew it. Eli just blew it. He misread the whole message and thought she was a drunk. And she has to convince him, no, I don't touch a drop of the stuff. I am here for another reason completely. But I just think that interpretation is so wild. It's really worth mentioning. We'll do a little bit more. Yudalad and Mitzvah next time we'll finish the chapter. So he says that, you're drinking. Stop. Put the bottle down. I know you like a little tipple, but this is not the time, not the place. And this is a fabulous thing. And again, we're talking about strong women in the Bible. This is the strength of Hannah to say this to the Gadol Ador. How many women can go to Ramosha Feinstein in his day and stand before him and make these kind of statements? We would be. I know that it's intimidating. I worked with a Yoetzet, one of the halachic advisors, who told me she had 1,300 questions in 1 year. I said, where were they coming from? She said, coming from the Hasidic community. This girl's Modnotop. And I said, really? Coming from the Hasidim? She said, yeah. Because they are so petrified to go and ask the rabbi, because they can't talk to him. And when they talk to the Rebbetzin, they realize that she hasn't got a clue about anything. That they've heard that there's a girl sitting in Teaneck, New Jersey, who actually knows not only halacha, but she also knows medicine. And the combination is a pretty amazing combination, and specializing in gynae problems. And all of a sudden, she's got 1,300 shayla. Halavai, every rabbi in his whole career would have 1,300 questions, let alone in 1 year. And that's what's going on here. To have the strength to be able to communicate, to stand up, and this is what Hannah does. And I find her again inspirational to the point where Shmuel has to come out. He comes out of Elkanah, his whole approach of bringing Jews back to God, and he comes from a Hannah who can stand up to Eli and say to him, Lo Adoni, you've got it wrong. Isha kashat ruach anocha, I am of vexed spirit. I'm not drunk, God forbid. I'm not standing here after having had a couple of shots somewhere else. I'm pouring out my soul before God. And he is overwhelmed. She continues, Al titenet amatcha lifnei bat Belial. Don't consider me like a godless woman. Himirov sichi v'ka'asi. I'm talking here out of the depths of my speech and my vexation. Dibarti adhena. This is what I've been saying till now. Vayan Eli vayomer lechi l'shalom. And you can see this 90-year-old man and long white beard, and he's looking at her and he says, I don't think he would have said bubala, but if she was younger, he might have said bubala. But he says to her, in no uncertain terms, go home. Velahei Yisrael yiteinet shelatei. God will provide your request, asher sha'alt me'imo, which you've requested. In other words, I'm giving you a bracha that you will be blessed with a child. Now, why they waited the 20 years, and Eli clearly was around for all that time to have this conversation, is something I have no answer to. But it came to a point where she davened so much and with such kavana and everything else, and Eli noticed, and then they had this interaction, and she told Eli the real deal, and she got a bracha, and of course we are told that's what happened. Just looking at the time, I think I'm going to hold it here. Just going to finish one more pasuk Yuchet. Vatoma, and she said, Timsa shivchat chachem beinecha. She's so delighted that she's found favor in the eyes of the great man. Vatelech ha'isha ledarka vatochal. She went home and she's eating. The eating is always the sign of, her calm, being more collected. And she didn't have that kind of sour look on her face anymore. And as a consequence, we'll read next week, Mitzvah Hashem, 2 weeks' time, what happened and the birth of Shmuel. What we will see, and this is again a thought for the day to ponder, is Shmuel at the age of 3. There is, again, we're going to go into Midrash, and I have to apologize, but this is such a delicious Midrash, I can't avoid telling you this story. Shmuel, at the age of 3, stands up in the temple when Hannah's fulfilling her promise. She's bringing him there, and he creates what is called in Yiddish a tumult. He creates an upheaval there, which is just beyond belief. It's so beyond belief that the Radak says it's beyond belief. He actually says Rakok. He says, I can't believe this. But he puts it to one side. He doesn't want to mention it. But a lot of the rabbis do. And Mitzvah Hashem, we'll see it next time. Bottom line of what we said today is, number one, how beautiful these stories really are. Inspiring people, inspiring leadership. And we hope and pray that we learn about inspiring leaders and inspiring leadership. Our leaders and our leadership will be also inspired, Bezrat Hashem, to do the right thing. And we'll see good things. Thank you, everybody. Erev Tov.
I have a question.